Well, good afternoon, everybody. I thank you for writing where you're calling in from. We have friends from coast to coast here in the US, but also we have folks tuning in from Canada, Italy, and Spain, and I'm sure there's others out there that I missed. So just a huge welcome to everybody today. My name is Carrie Berger, and I am the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. The consortium is part of a 15-member collaborative network of fire science exchanges that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. Each exchange is working to communicate fire science within their regions and then also working across regions to share best practices. So to learn more about the Northwest Fire Science Consortium and the exchange network, visit our website at northwestfirescience.org. And let me see here if I can quickly add it to the chat window. There you go. To avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Also, I will be recording the webinar and will archive it on our website and YouTube channel. And you can find both those web addresses in the chat window, and I'll add that YouTube link here in a minute. I also want to note that I tried something new today, and we're going live on Facebook, so you can catch this live on our Facebook page, and others too who might not have known about this webinar. So there you go. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Steve Pine. Steve is an emeritus professor at Arizona State University and the author of numerous books on fire. Last month, Steve gave a webinar for the North Science Consortium on a fire history of the Pacific Northwest. And it was in that webinar that Steve teased us with his theory of the Pyrocene. Then he sparked even more interest in his theory at the Association for Fire Ecology Conference in Tucson, Arizona. So I think inquiring minds want to know, Steve, what the Pyrocene is all about. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Like all of us, I'm concerned about our planetary future. I've been particularly struck by the observations of some commentators that future is so strange and so dire that we have no narrative possible for it and no analog, that we can't connect past and future, and we don't have a matrix for understanding what that future might be. Well, I disagree. I'm a fire guy. I think we have a great narrative. It's the narrative of people in fire. And I think we have a very apt analog, what I'm taken to calling the Pyrocene, which is that when you add up all of our combustion practices, we are creating the fire equivalent of an ice age. So let me explain what I mean by that.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Before you go into explaining, I am getting some messages that say your audio sounds muffled a little bit and is hard to hear. So if you could just speak up a little bit, I think that will be helpful.
Okay, just a second.
Okay.
We'll see if this does any better. Okay, so let's go back about 3 million years. The Earth was going through a large period of secular cooling, which has continued with bumps and rises and falls. But about 2.6 million years ago, the Pleistocene epoch began to respond to climate changes induced by the Milankovitch cycle. Now, these are various rhythms that have to do with the tilting and wobbling of the Earth and the amount of sunlight that actually reaches particular parts of the planet. So we begin setting in a series of rhythms where ice expands, ice contracts. And the main features at about 80% of the Pleistocene, that is 80% of the last 2.6 million years, have been glacial. About 90% of the last 600,000 years. The current interglacial, somewhat different, a little longer and sharper than what had gone on in the past. The graph below there is actually of atmospheric CO2 levels, but that's a pretty good proxy for the ice Those blue bands indicate the short, sharply warming periods, the interglacials, but you can see the dominant period is glacial. And there's really nothing to interrupt that cycle in the way the Earth is set up. There have been some regressions, a period of about 300 to 400 years, depending how you measure it. It's known as the Little Ice Age. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. But otherwise, we've been in an interglacial that seems to be much more intense, has different features, doesn't seem to be showing the characteristics of inflecting back into a glacial era, which all the others would indicate. So, features of the Pleistocene. Well, the most famous, of course, are the great ice sheets and glaciers, continental scale. There were lots of periglacial landscapes, loess plains, sandy outwash plains, lots of other features associated with the ice, which completely perturbed the whole dynamic of the Earth's atmosphere. There were lakes that didn't freeze up, often filled up with water. Think of the Great Basin area, the western United States, lots of soil was permafrost, and so on. So the effect of the ice was not just the ice sheets, it was a global chilling in many forms. All that ice dropped to sea level as much as 100 meters on at least 4 occasions. And all this this great whipsawing of climates led to a series of mass extinctions, collectively referred to as the fifth extinction. And not least, it is during the Pleistocene that our hominin ancestors appeared. So here they are, gathering around a fire, bringing stuff to burn to that fire, which is basically what we do. So that's the prelude. Now we go to the end, the beginning of the last interglacial. What happens? And let's talk about what we do with fire in living landscapes. All right, great painting. I love this from Australia. Capturing fire from nature, putting it into a fire stick. Well, we got small guts and big heads because we learned to cook food. And then we went to the top of the food chain because we learned to cook landscapes. And now we've become a geologic force ourselves because we've begun to cook the planet. We became a species monopolist. At one point, there were lots of hominins who could do it. Now there's only one. We are the keystone species for fire on the planet. And we began using it to make the world more habitable for ourselves. I don't think we've added up all of the climatic impacts of aboriginal burning. By that I mean control over fire primarily by ignition. But think about all of the tallgrass prairies, the wet prairies, the wetter steppes, the sour felt in Africa, all of which, when you remove human fire, tend to fill up quickly with trees. All this had consequences. We began changing things very quickly. But we still wanted more power. And the problem with aboriginal burning, I use aboriginal with a small a, is that its power depends on the power of fire to spread, and the power of fire to spread depends on the environment. I mean, you can't force fire where it's not going to happen. You can take over fire-prone areas and so forth. You can modify things. You can bring fire to fire-prone landscapes that lack ignition, but there are real limits. If you want to exceed those limits, you have to go to another stage, which is what I think of as the agricultural phase of fire history. That is, you begin changing the fields. You slash, you drain, you introduce livestock, you do all kinds of things which expose more area to burn, more stuff to burn. Our quest for fire has pretty much been a quest for more things to burn and more opportunities to burn. So we expand the time and places of burning, and this time we're removing lots of stored carbon and releasing it. So does all of that have any connection with climate records? And here I was really inspired reading many years ago William Rudiman's explorations of this topic and the connections that have since been made by others to demography and land use and the climate. So we did have this significant little mini eruption of an ice age, little ice age, roughly 1550 to 1850. Some people would start it earlier, maybe in the 14th century. I've got this graph, which is a little confusing, but follow the blue line because it exaggerates a bit the medieval warm period and then the Little Ice Age. And let me map onto that some of the stuff that's going on, at least in Europe. It's a time of land clearing. Usually we think of that as, well, it's warmer, easier to farm. It's a good time to clear land. But there's also a sense in which the land clearing might contribute to the warming. And then we have a period of plague and invasion. European population collapses by as much as a third or more in certain places. And the warm period fades. Well, was the chilling part of the disease environment, or was it the reverse? I'm not so much interested in which is the quote driver. I'm interested in the interaction. We're always going to interact, and the nature of that interaction is what interests us. And then we have this massive demographic collapse in the Americas upon contact. As much as 90% of the population in many areas. Some of this taking a few decades to work through, but really a global moment. And we have, following that, a Little Ice Age. We certainly had the reclamation of many previously farmed lands, both in Eurasia and in the Americas, by trees. So there's a lot of sopping up of what carbon dioxide had been released and so forth. And then by the middle of the 19th century, another wave of clearing associated with this great outburst of European settler societies, and a real rash of combustion. Okay, so that's the general chronology.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you again. Apologies, but I'm still getting messages in that you sound muffled and quiet. So let's just pause a second and do figure out a sound check here for you. So
let me try another microphone.
Yep, perfect. Let's go for that. And maybe worst case scenario, I'd have you call in on your cell phone. That usually is my backup and always works great.
Okay, is this doing any better?
Can you talk a couple more sentences?
No, let's see. We've got a bunch of historical coincidences. They may become correlations, but
that sounds better to me. If somebody could just give me a shout out that was having a problem before, that sounds better. Somebody is saying. So let's roll with that for now. Yep. Okay, and somebody said it sounded fine the whole time to them. So I guess it just depends on folks' audio, but it does sound better to me. Let's roll with it. I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but I think we're good. Okay.
That's right. So basically, we have a bunch of historical coincidences here. Are they correlations? Well, they might be, but I don't think not many people are yet willing to devise a cause and effect. But I don't think we need to know which is the driver. There's an interaction going on, and that's enough for my purposes now. So a big change. One of the things that happens at the end of the Little Ice Age is that our quest for fire has taken us in a search for more things to burn, and so we're reaching into the geologic past. We decide we'll burn what I like to call lithic landscapes. These were once living landscapes. They're now fossilized. This is fossilized biomass. This is what normal people call fossil fuels. So it's all the coal, oil, gas, and so forth. This is essentially an unbounded source of energy, source of burning for us. And it leads to what I like to call the Pyric transition. This is kind of a squirrely word, and I find that very few people seem to understand it in the way that I do. I'll try once more, and if you don't, it doesn't make sense, ignore it. But I coined the term by analogy to the demographic transition, which occurs in human populations when they begin industrializing. The birth rate stays high, the death rate declines, so you have this massive rise in population, and then the birth rate plummets, eventually going below replacement value, and so the entire population begins declining. And looking at the history of fire during this period, a bunch of things are going on. We've got colonization, land clearing and stuff, but we also have this Pyric transition going on. We're converting more and more to fossil fuels, and I see this explosion of fires, and then as technological substitution, suppression, and so forth occur, the number of fires, landscape fires, falls below replacement value. It can no longer do the ecological work that's required. So a couple of things are interesting, seems to me, on this. One is that the history of humanity and fire has long been one of looking for more things to burn. But now the story is shifting from sources, which are effectively unbounded. We can go hundreds of years just with what we know, to sinks. We've taken all this stuff out of the geologic past, we're burning it in the present, releasing its effluent basically to the geologic future. It's a problem of sinks. This stuff has nowhere to go, and where it is going is upending lots of earth processes. And in the past, regardless of what we burned, we were always within certain large ecological barriers. I mean, you don't burn in snow. You can't burn in lakes. There are seasons. There are parameters with the character of the fuel and the possibilities of ignitions. And that was always limited. We could expand them. They were elastic. We could move in and out. We could recode them. We could do lots of things. But there were ultimately some limits. Now there aren't. All of those limits are gone. We can burn day and night, winter and summer, drought or deluge. It doesn't matter. So we're simply overloading and in a way bypassing all of the ecological checks and balances that have gone on before. So this is a massive phase change in fire history. And this Pyric transition begins working over all of the various habitats that people enjoy. And we can see the conversion. So we go from working flames. We had always used flame. We needed fire in the form of something that basically flame, but now who needs candles? Got electricity. Who needs hearths? We've got propane gas stoves, electric ranges. And for fireplaces, we can just go digital and broadcast on a monitor a fire. What about urban landscapes? You know, our cities used to burn as often as the countryside. They were made of the same materials. Part of this conversion, our cities don't burn in that way anymore. Particularly the more modern and urban core areas. There are a few fires, usually during some transition period, construction or whatever, but basically fire is gone. We don't have working fires in our city. And frankly, I'm happy to have a lot of this out of the city and out of the house. But it continues. It goes into our agricultural lands. How much of our agricultural land outside of some irrigated floodplains was based on fire, farming, pastoralism. All of them required fire at some point for fumigating, fertilizing. Now, we use pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides. We distribute with machines, more internal combustion. Well, that means we don't have to grow stuff to feed draft animals, but we've made this conversion. We don't have to fallow anymore. Fallow was where a lot of the biodiversity in agricultural systems lay. That's been eliminated. So again, we see this working over. And what about wildlands? Well, this this conversion occurs at the same time that in places like the United States, Canada, Australia, Russia are all actively colonizing new lands. And we see this explosion of fire, many damaging and abusive fires, often lethal. These fires are an order of magnitude larger in size and lethality than the mega fires we've had in the past few decades. And I have rails on the upper left and lower right because the railroads powered by coal were the catalyst for opening up these lands, and were also a tremendous source of fire. This havoc didn't go unnoticed, and it was a global problem, and it led to state-sponsored conservation. Began another global program, at least by the European powers, and it was turned over. One of its bases was to create reserves to prevent fire and axe from wrecking this kind of pandemonium. So it was turned over to forestry, and forestry was ill-equipped for the task intellectually, but that's another story. This was a global project, as I say, whether in the northern Rockies of North America or the central hills of India. And one of my favorite illustrations of the power of these ideas was Rudyard Kipling's stories of Mowgli, because he wrote a sequel, What Happens to Mowgli After He Grows Up, and what happens is that Mowgli joins the Indian Forest Service and becomes a fire guard. So wildlands, the way you protected yourself against unwanted fire in wildlands was to burn. Here we've got an example of backfiring in the face of a prairie fire, but burning, protective burning. Burning of all sorts was how you got the fires you wanted and repelled or denied the fires you didn't want. How do we do it today? We do it with fossil fuels. In effect, we try to mount a counterfire based on industrial combustion. And in many places this works up until the fires become really nasty. And the more you succeed in this, the larger and meaner the fires may become. But if we were to take away all of our planes and helicopters, all of our bulldozers, all of our engines and tankers, all of our chainsaws and pumps, and all the rest of it, what kind of fire suppression could we engage in? We would be pulling back a great distance and burning out. It would be the only way to control large fires. In a sense, we're moving back to something like this with the kind of box and burn strategy. But the effect would have been to leave a lot of fire on the land. Instead, by going for a suppression program, trying to find technological substitutes, eliminate all kinds of open fire, as we've done in all these other habitats, we created a problem. Okay. And I'd like to point out that all this happens even in the absence of anthropogenic climate change. There are many, many effects of converting to fossil fuels. Climate change is a big one, but there are lots of other things as well. In fact, the United States went through a large revolution, essentially, in its fire policy 50 years ago, based on the effects of these changes in the absence of climate change, at a time when climatologists were telling us we were headed into a new ice age and it was inevitable. Well, that changed. What happens now, the living landscapes, the fires decline, the lithic landscapes, the burning rises. So there's a background graph. You can see the uptick. This is only to 2000, it would double by now. And here's a graph of burned area for the United States. And we can see essentially the same change. And this has gone on elsewhere. So that's what I mean by this transition. And then we can add climate change as a performance enhancer and a kind of generalizer, and we've got all the ingredients we need for a pyrocene. So, quick review. A long era, 420 plus million years, natural fire. And in a way, kind of patchy. Some areas burn a lot, some don't burn as much. Different patterns, different rhythms. When people come in, they recode it, change the pulses and patches of burning. A lot of it is now encased in agriculture. The areas that they don't treat are left open, available for lightning or wildfire of one kind or another. And we also expand the domain of fire far beyond what it would have been in its natural condition. And then we go into this third fire, industrial fire, or the burning of these lithic landscapes. And you can see I'm no graphic artist, but I'm trying to indicate here that there's a third dimension, a deep temporal dimension here, because we're taking stuff out of the geologic past, putting it into the geologic future. And one of the interesting things that happens, one of the things industrial societies like to do is to create reserves, nature reserves and so forth. And so we create habitats, in effect, for fire. So it's a great era for lightning fire, and it's a great era for industrial combustion. It's not such a great era for traditional burning. There's plenty going on, but these are in places that haven't yet met the transition. So here's some evening satellite photos of lights, two categories. One, sub-Saharan Africa, pretty nicely aglow with burning living landscapes. And you can see some places around, say, Johannesburg, where you've got extensive urban development where you don't have it. The two don't coexist. There's a transition period, which can be very tricky, but otherwise they don't coexist. Here we have Europe. Nope, not all of those lights are combustion driven. France has a big nuclear program, lots of hydropower, but generally, this is a domain where you don't have much open fire. And what's lost as you make the transition between these two realms is that traditional realm of anthropogenic burning. And we can see some spectacular examples of this here in North Korea, conspicuous by the absence of light at night. But if you look at MODIS satellites during the day, there are all the hot spots. So this is a case where the differences are completely contained within political boundaries between places that otherwise have no significant difference between them. And we can see some in the US. This is one of my favorite photos, two very different visions of fire and very different views of the future. So Biosphere 2, no place for fire, zero. Completely self-contained, engineered world. In the background, Santa Catalina Mountains, full-throated wildfire in play. Fire's going to happen there. It needs to happen there. But two very different competing views. And we can see that they line up pretty well with different understandings, at least in the US. So famous photo, the Elk Bath of the 2000 Northern Rockies fires sort of fine in nature, and fire not so fine in cities. It's Santa Rosa, California, in the 2017 fire. These are two different worlds, and there's very little middle between them. We seem to operate in one or the other. What's missing here is a sense of ourselves as sort of active agents, using fire to make the world more habitable. Well, anyway, megafires have now joined the polar bear and his forlorn ice flow as an emblem of the Anthropocene. Certainly an emblem of climate change and a dismal future awaiting us. Suggest that we can also think beyond climate change, that this is a problem of the world's keystone species for fire changing its fire practices in a full spectrum kind of way, in terms of our energy sources, our land use, how we organize that land, how we do our agriculture, how we think about fire in wildlands, how we move ourselves around, and all kinds of other ecological pathologies, that seem to be associated with this transition. So there are a whole bunch of things going on. I remember seeing a year or so ago some estimates that perhaps 40% of the big fires in California could be attributed to climate change. But if you look at what underwrites so much of the land use changes and the kinds of settlements we have, that's also fossil fuel. So we might be able to up the whole fossil fuel component to something closer to 80%. I like the way the sense in which power lines have been so prolific to start, because it's a sense in which these two fire realms collide violently at the most inappropriate times. So we had a fire crisis before climate change became a recognized concern. And now I think the fire crisis is morphing into a fire epoch. So let me suggest we may be going from a fire age to an ice age to a fire age. Our fire practices have long affected living landscapes, and that is surely interactive with climatic components. Pyric transition going from living to lithic landscapes has just put that on afterburners. And fire is shaping our world as fully as ice in the Pleistocene. And people are speaking of novel ecosystems. Here's one of my favorite polar bears feeding on burning garbage at Churchill. And I would submit that even climate history is now a sub-narrative of fire history. So my sense is not removing climate change as a component. It's looking at fire as a larger underwriter of change, of which climate change is one. So let's go back to the Pleistocene. What's changed? Well, at the Pyrocene, climate change here is now basically from fossil fuel combustion and the various knock-on consequences of that. We have fire-informed biomas, not just feature for which fire is frequent, but for which fire is becoming essential in some ways. We might even include our modern cities. If we took all of our combustion away of our cities, they would quickly shut down. And we could speak of peripyric and pyropluvial landscapes. It might be a way to factor in smoke balls. These might be the equivalent of pluvial lakes and so forth. We have a rise in sea level, and we are looking toward another mass extinction. And what about ourselves? Here are ancestors gathering stuff to burn. And here we are today in cars fleeing. This is part of the Fort McMurray fire in Alberta, a town that was set up to mine tar sands for fossil fuels, now caught between two fires, the world that fossil fuel created and the fires that are still there in the living bush. So what do we get from the Pyrocene as a concept? This is just Pine's latest hobby horse. Well, maybe. I like it because it puts fire in focus. And I remind you that focus, by the way, comes from the Latin word for hearth. Fire is the focus. And it makes fire an informing principle. It gives us a narrative that some observers are claiming we don't have. It gives us an analogy. Again, some critics worry that we don't have. I think it gives us a sense of the scale of fire influences. And we're not just talking wildlands here, we're talking about all kinds of habitat and what has happened to fire as it functions in those habitats through us. It makes us the active agent here. It's a kind of sideways entry into climate and global change stuff. If you put fire at the middle, the world looks a bit different. That's useful. It's not going to appeal to everybody. In fact, some people who are already deeply invested in the existing discourses, if you will, may be deeply irked by the thought that somebody else is out there suggesting there's another way to look at it. And indeed, the last thing we need is yet another term floating around. But I'm going to push it anyway. And while I'm not in a position to do it, one could see this becoming, helping to shape a research program. So there it is. What does a full-blown fire age look like? We're about to find out. So if you'd like some more, there's contact information, email. I've got a website, and I've developed a part of that on the Pyrocene, which includes some of my thoughts and essays today. So thank you very much.
That's great, Steve. Thank you so much for the webinar. Like I said, you teased us in your other webinar and presented a bit at the AFI conference, and so this was fantastic to hear it on this webinar, as well as a live stream on Facebook. That worked out great. Some folks are on Facebook. Now is the time to get in your questions and comments to Steve. He'd be happy to answer those for you, so go ahead and type those into the chat books or into the question and answer. Someone did ask if the slides would be available afterwards, and I do record this webinar. It will be available on our YouTube channel as well as the consortium webpage, so you can see the slides and hear through there. let's see here. Okay. While we wait for questions to come in, I just want to make an announcement that we do have other webinars coming up this winter, including a presentation by Courtney Schultz and Heidi Huber-Stearns on their findings on policy barriers and opportunities, strategies for increasing prescribed fire application on federal lands from case studies in the US West. That's happening at the end of January, and you can find out more information about that webinar on our website. But better yet, why don't you just go ahead and sign up for our listserv and just get automatic notifications for our webinars and the other things that we do with the consortium. Webinars is just one way we try to reach out to people. We also provide research briefs and fire facts. We host workshops and field tours and things like that. So be in the know, sign up for our listserv. I don't see any questions coming in. I'm going to check the live Facebook feed. We do have one here. Let's see. Okay. We got a question in. I recall some very large boreal fires in northern Saskatchewan and other areas in the 70s, no road access. The explanation then was that these fires had no human intervention, so they got very large. These were jack pine communities for the most part. At the time was considered fire dependent for the cones to open and disperse the seed.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an observation. Is there a question? I'm sorry.
And then just a quick thank you to you, Steve, and myself. Somebody's tuning in from Ireland. That's fantastic. That's so great. We do have a question coming in through our Facebook Live, and it might be just a comment, but let me read here. I believe nuclear power needs to be a stronger solution to replace fossil fuel burning. This person used to be a nuclear reactor operator. What are your thoughts, Steve?
Well, we've got lots of options for weaning ourselves off fossil fuel or binge burning of fossil fuels. And I think we need to pursue all of them. I like mixed economies. I like mixed solutions. I like mixed ways of putting fire back into the landscape. Relying on only one is not wise. Some places are simply not going to tolerate nuclear power. I'm more tolerant about it. I think we're getting better at it, and it's a case of what risk we're willing to trade. And I think at this point, if we're really serious, I think nuclear power has got to be one option. But I don't think it's certainly not the only one.
Great. And Steve, if I could just have you just continue that level and speak up just a little bit more. We've got a question here. There seems like a lot of overlap between the concepts of Pyrocene and Anthropocene. Are they different?
Well, that's a great question. They're different, but they're also cousins. My sense of the Anthropocene is that I would simply rename the Holocene, the epoch of the Holocene, as the Anthropocene. I think human influence has been continuous and rising throughout that. We don't need to wait until we begin burning coal. We don't need that for the trigger event. So I would rename the Holocene the Anthropocene, and I'm willing, being a fire guy and a fire historian, I would rename the Anthropocene the Pyrocene. And in saying that, it's not that I want to get rid of Anthropocene. I like the term. I'm happy to have people use it. I'm proposing a parallel way of looking at that era, because most of our environmental impact is going to be directly or indirectly through our firepower. Fire is what has given us the leverage. That's the Archimedean fulcrum, the lever that has allowed us to move landscapes and even the planet. So by looking at fire, we get other things out of our understanding. So that doesn't encompass everything, but very little that people do does not have a fire component. So it's an alternative way, a parallel way of doing it, and it allows us to see fresh and perhaps differently how we might define some of the problems. It's also, I think, a better way of thinking about the actual problems with wildfires and smoke and the fire in living landscapes component. Simply blaming climate change for that is not good enough because there are lots of other factors at work. If you approach it from fire, not fire is derived from other things, but fire as the central narrative, fire as the informing process, then it allows us to think more widely about how to handle these kinds of fires. So that's my reasoning for it.
Great.
Whether you like it or not, I don't think we have to have, one term, one word, some jealous word that will have no others before it. We can tolerate lots of different terms. We get different things out of them.
Right. This person says, thank you, Dr. Pine. Of the enormous load of information synthesized here, what one or two key messages do you think need to be understood by the general public for those of us tasked with education?
Oh, great question. Now you're forcing me to quit being an academic. Your retiring wasn't enough. You have to do it. You can take me out of the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. I think one thing is that the consequences of our binge burning of fossil fuels is worse than we thought. It's broader than just climate change. And I think it also suggests that as we begin dealing with fires in living landscapes, the kinds of things we've been seeing in California and in Australia and beginning to see elsewhere as well, we need to realize the variety of fire and our ability to do something. There's no one thing to do. I mean, I liken fire to a driverless car. It's just barreling down the road, integrating everything around it. At some point, that may be a sharp curve called climate change, or a tricky intersection where town and country meet, or whatever. But it's integrating all these things, which means there are also lots of things, little things we can do, gradually chisel away. But the other thing underwriting that is that we need to think seriously about fire on its own terms. And it's also part of my reasoning behind the Pyrocene, because fire is so visceral, it's so graphic, that it gets hijacked all the time for other agendas. So we propose solutions, or people come up and they want to use fire to advance some other cause. And they don't really propose stuff that solves or addresses the fire issue as it's understood by fire. They want to say, well, if we just logged it off, or if we didn't build houses, or if we did whatever, it would go away. No, there are too many things involved. But that also means there are bunches of little things we can do. And it's just another way of framing it. So here I am. I'm already rambling on instead of my 20-second elevator talk. I would say again, it's the magnitude of the fossil fuel transition, larger than most of us think. The interactions it is having with living landscapes is more complicated than we think, but it's also something we can deal with if we choose. We don't have to solve the climate change problem to be able to solve, to live with, to ride out until we can get the climate change issue, global warming issue solved. We can ride it out more wisely with how we live on the landscape.
Great. A lot of questions coming in. Let's see here. Just wondering what you think about wild area fire scale prior to humans.
Oh, I really don't know. I mean, we have some, it really depends on the location. I mean, some places that are grasslands, we know grasslands can start from lightning. in the right conditions, they can burn very, very large expanses of land. The same in boreal forest. When the fuel conditions are lined up, you've got continuous stuff where they can burn very large patches, and they can burn for very long times. So one of the things people do to interrupt the cycle is not to stop a fire when it's making a run, but the ability to corral it before it makes a second or third or fourth run. So I think we would have had much larger fires than we would anticipate because we manage in a variety of ways to shut them down. So there would have been places that would have had very large fires and they would have burned over a very long time, months.
Okay. Let's see here. Has anyone started to focus on the role that episodes of wind and atmospheric instability have on the incident of megafires?
Yeah, I think there are a number of people doing that. I can't cite anybody right offhand, but that I think is a major topic because it's the winds, particularly the winds at the onset of the fire, that allow them to escape control to the point that we really can't do much in response. So that's also where power lines are such an insidious factor. And there's really, I mean, power lines is a great example of something that has a fairly simple technological fix. There are a variety of things we can do. Again, not just one thing, but there's no reason that we have to shut off power or just live with these explosive events. That's something, yeah. I mean, we have examples from that. We had a problem with railroad fires in the 19th, early 20th century. And if we can take on the railroad fires to the point where they have become essentially negligible now, I don't know why we can't do the same with power lines.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Steve, I'm sorry to keep asking you, but if you could speak up just a little bit, I'm having a hard time hearing your answer and knowing when to feed you another one. But Ron Steffens, listening in from Tucson, Arizona. Hi, Ron. He's wanting to know, there's been talk about the role of Aboriginal fire versus fuel management fire in Australia. Do you have any thoughts on how the Pyrocene narrative may help us through this either-or approach?
Wow, that's a great topic because cultural burning, as it's called in Australia, and as we're starting to see in the United States as well, pockets of this, is very interesting. I find interesting because it represents a third voice to we either burn or don't burn, or we burn for fuel reduction, or we have to burn for ecological purposes. Burning for cultural reasons is the third one. I'm happy for all of them. I think they all do different things. And in many ways, the Florida model of prescribed burning as a kind of set piece works great in the Southeast, spectacularly in Florida. I don't see that it's worked at scale in the West. And what we're seeing are kind of hybrids. I mean, there's kind of managed wildfire, box and burn, where there's a kind of active engagement with the fire in using that fire, using the opportunities by the fire to get some nice percentage of good fire down on the land. That is a kind of hybrid prescribed fire that I welcome. I think we're going to need all kinds of fires from all kinds of purposes. And in some ways, I don't care what prism people see them through, as long as the fire happens in a way that makes sense ecologically, or that addresses the issues that we're concerned about. People can look at the same thing and see it 3 or 4 different ways. I don't care. This isn't about converting people. It isn't about who gets the right to name this kind of fire and the rest. What matters, if we spend time arguing over that, we don't get the burning done. So I'm very pantheistic about this, if you will. I think that's a very interesting development, and I think it also in Australia provides a way for people to reintroduce fire and think about landscape differently. That is kind of culturally sanctioned. Otherwise, they're live. There's so much sort of trench warfare that goes on between different groups arguing over this and that. It provides an end run around a lot of these things. So I'm rather encouraged. I think there are real opportunities here.
Mhm. Okay, do you have any thoughts about cost benefit of prescribed burning? It seems like many landscapes have excessive fuel loads, but burning them could increase atmospheric carbon.
Well, I mean, most fire is conservative in that eventually the landscape returns. Now, if we've got pretty serious climate change and invasive species, et cetera, it may not come back to the same level of carbon storage it had before. So at that point, you're really transforming it into something else. But otherwise, I tend to think that all this smoke um, really is another encumbrance. I mean, unless the smoke is impacting human health, I think the smoke arguments are another way of shutting down burning. There are a lot of people who really don't like burning. And there's a very deep tradition in European thinking that has fire, makes fire the stigma of the primitive. And European foresters and agronomists were very clear about this well into the 20th century, that if you use fire, you are primitive. If you find an alternative to fire, then you are rational and you are on the way to modernity. And that's really pretty strongly in certain elements of the culture, intellectual culture. And I'm astonished at how they keep finding new ways. Oh, we're not opposed to it in principle, but now we have this other objection. Now we're adding to, well, look, the burning that goes on in living landscapes, unless you're doing massive land clearing like in the Amazon, where the whole point is to replace the landscape, mostly fire recycles it. That's not an issue. The issue is taking stuff out of the earth and releasing it all over the place into the future. That's the smoke we need to worry about. Mostly we don't see that. It's hidden. It's coming out of our cars. It's coming out of other industrial plants and so forth. The smoke that we see is not for me an issue, except where it sits in for weeks in palms, like it is in Sydney and Canberra, and then becomes a very serious public health issue. But that's too late. You can't shut down the fires at that point. But then that becomes another argument. Well, if you're burning a bush, then you're releasing the smoke, and then it gets caught up into these old sort of dichotomies, and it goes back and forth. That's where I think the Aboriginal side, the cultural burning, may help to split that polarity of that. It becomes more of a three-body problem.
So coming in, another question here. Our ponderosa pine forests in British Columbia are considered to be historically fire maintained by First Nations. Did those pine forests evolve to adapt to First Nations burning, or were they already pre-adapted?
Well, I can't see how they weren't pre-adapted. I don't know it in enough detail to be able to comment on this. But what I could see was that First Nation burning could have kept them at a time in Ponderosa, at a time when left alone, the climate and other pressures may very well have led to fir or spruce or some other forest, or gone the other way to brush. I could see First Nation expanding it, but I don't know. I see no basis to say that they were evolutionarily adapted to it. That had to happen long before people were concerned. But I think people can rework it, can change the extent, can change the relative proportions and so forth. That would be my best explanation.
Great, and Karen writes in that for those that related to the excellent question about our role as educators, see this document on Steve's webpage, written for journalists but applicable to the general public, and the link is given there. So thank you for that, Karen. So we have one here. Dr. Pine, do you have any suggestions for messaging for prescribed fire use, operations for a state where climate change is front and center, both politically and at the community's docks?
Yeah, I think the good fire, bad fire message is not a bad one. And I realize some natural scientists will cringe at that, but we don't live in a world simply of nature. We live in a cultural world. We live in a moral world. We have to make choices. And I think good fire, bad fire is a very apt one. It also allows us, well, yeah, we need more good fire, less bad fire. I mean, my formula for the state of the world and fire is that we have too much bad fire, too little good fire, and too much combustion overall. And people seem to get that. I would hope also that maybe the Pyrocene concept can visualize it. They may not visualize it in the way I intend, but they seem to be able to visualize it, and it allows them to think about fire in a different way, a slightly different way. And that may allow us to get the prescribed fire message out. But I really do think that the costs and risks and the rest, I just don't see it happening in the Western U.S. at scale. And I really think the future is a smarter use of managed wildfires, a mix of things. Again, I like mixed economies, and I don't see how we're going to get sufficient doses of good fire back without using all the fires that are open to us. And prescribed fire is just becoming too encumbered.
Okay. Steve, which do you think is a bigger driver to current extreme wildfire behavior, climate change or increase in ignition sources along the wild and urban interface?
Well, I think there are all kinds of things going on. Human ignitions, Jennifer Balch and her colleagues did a paper on how human ignitions have greatly expanded the fire season. So they're interacting with climate change to do it. So it's not just climate change leading to more fires, it's how we interact with it again. So there are a lot of things, again, power lines. It's ridiculous that the power line situation hasn't been addressed. We've reached this state. Get those off. That is a major source of really large fires. And it's not just in California. I mean, the Gatlinburg fires. They decided not to charge the two juveniles who started a fire in the park, which burned in the town, because there were so many fires started by power lines that merged and burned into the town that they couldn't sort them out. Or Bastrop County fires in Texas, the Las Conchas fire in New Mexico. I mean, it just goes on and on. This is something that we can fix. This is an ignition problem. A large fraction of our mega fires have been the result of human ignitions occurring during high winds or being left on the landscape of abandoned campfires where they were eventually were caught in high wind. This is something we could target and fix. Again, there are a whole bunch of things. There's not just one thing to do, one driver. There are all sorts of things, and different places will have different mixes of these. We can't stop the winds. We can do other stuff. And I really have come to believe that the wildland urban interface problem got misdefined right at the origins. It got defined by the wildland fire community, which saw it as houses coming in, encroaching on lands that they needed to manage, and they needed to manage fire. And instead, we could have picked up the other end of that stick and said, these are really urban fires with funny landscaping that looks like wildland. If you defined it as urban fires right from the start, it's pretty clear what you do to keep them from burning. The evidence is overwhelming about embers being the primary ignition source, and then stuff right adjacent to the house, within 3 or 4 feet of the structure. catching fire from the embers or some of the creeping surface fires and are being responsible. So I regard that's something that we could fix. It just got defined as something other than what I think it is. And so we've come up with all kinds of solutions that really aren't tackling the issue.
Yeah, so thank you, Steve. Unfortunately, I just heard the bell go off on campus here. It is 2 o'clock. I want to be mindful of Steve's time and everybody who's online with us, your time. I know we didn't get to all of the questions. There's a lot of great questions out there. Yeah, so I guess I just want to close by saying thank you again to Steve for coming on and giving us a webinar and on this topic that everybody was so very interested in. And then to you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen in, whether you listen directly in the webinar or went on live to the Facebook page. Thank you. And yeah, just as a reminder, we have some upcoming webinars. Check out our website at northwestfirescience.org. And with that, I'll close for today and just say have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.